What I'd like to do now is introduce our keynote speaker, Rick Westhead. Rick is a senior correspondent for TSN and a contributor to CTV News and W5. He's got about 25 years of award-winning investigative journalism behind him. And he covers some of the most interesting topics as far as I'm concerned, because he wants to cover sexual abuse in sports. And I think that shows incredible courage for a sports journalist in today's age. And I applaud it every single time I see him break something. I think it's great, so thank you. This man is making changes within some of the worst institutions that deal with sexual assault. So thank you again, and we're excited to hear you speak.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Just a quick question before I start. Who here has been interviewed by somebody in the media before? All of you. Great. Okay. So a couple weeks ago, I got a phone call from a man who lives in the east end of Toronto, and he asked if I'd meet with him and his wife. And we met for coffee, and they shared an experience that their daughter had gone through. And they told me that during the 2022-2023 winter sports season, that their daughter, who was then 16, was playing ringette. And that twice during the course of this season, that her coach, who was a man in his 40s, had walked into the dressing room of girls who were 16 without knocking, without making sure that they were ready for him to walk in. And when he walked in, they were, in a state of undress. So the family told me that they'd made a complaint about this behavior to the Ringette Association, and that the Ringette Association had suspended him twice. They'd done an investigation that had an independent third party, and he'd been suspended the first time this happened for 2 games, and the second time for 5 games. And what was interesting to me, and the reason that I thought it was worth doing a story, is what happened next. They told no one. They didn't tell Ringette Ontario. They didn't tell Ringette Canada. They decided to protect the reputation of the club and tell no one, and they kept it secret. And so, for me, covering Ringette is obviously not TSN's bread and butter. We cover the Blue Jays and the Raptors and the Toronto Maple Leafs in professional sports. Yet, I think this story of the Ringette piece and the reporting that went into that, this was a series of probably a dozen interviews with that family, at least as many drafts of a story, all of which were vetted by our lawyers. There was a real investment in making sure that we did journalism that met our standards. And that was important because over the last couple of years at TSN, I think that our track record shows that we're really putting purpose ahead of our profits. And we're really trying to make a change. So I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I love the chance to talk about what journalism is and how we do it, because I think that there's a real misunderstanding that the public has about how our jobs actually work. So I wanted to talk a little bit briefly about my own career path and how I got to be at TSN and the reporting that I do here. But more importantly, I just want to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit and explain, like I said, how journalism actually happens, how we turn these tips, anonymous often, sometimes direct messages on Twitter or Instagram, and how that actually becomes investigative reporting. Journalism, of course, is under attack. The public trust in journalists has never been lower than it is right now. There's disinformation campaigns from, in some cases, governments around the world. The expression fake news is one that everyone, I'm sure, here is familiar with. And at the same time, credible news organizations are being stripped bare. Newsrooms are being closed. No one is in the public. There are many people in the public now are no longer paying for news, and the price that has is that we can't sustain independent reporting, right? It costs money to do this work. So just to start with my story, I'm from Burlington, just outside Toronto, and I grew up I knew that I was going to be a journalist and a writer from the time, but even before I was a teenager. And I remember being in a writer's craft class in high school, and one of the assignments I had was to write a profile of someone. I went to school with the son of a man who was a broadcaster for the Toronto Blue Jays named Tom Cheek. So I went over as a 17-year-old and wrote a profile of Tom Cheek, and my teacher said, you know, if you get this published, we'll bump up your grade. And so that's how I started in journalism. I went to TMU, then called Ryerson, and I was always on the hustle, always looking for opportunities to freelance. One of those came in about 1995. The Toronto Blue Jays and all the other teams in Major League Baseball went on strike, and so I decided that I'd go and try for the Blue Jays. So that's me. I knew that I would be the first player cut, but that wasn't the point. The point was going down and writing about the experience, writing about what it was like to be on the field where the professional players played. So I sold that story to the Toronto Sun and was interviewed by the Star and other media outlets at the time. And I thought I was on my path. I was on the path. I was on my way to becoming a full-time journalist. Except, time and again, I'd apply to places like the Toronto Star and the Sun and the National Post and the Globe and Mail and the CBC and CTV and Global News. And I was told again and again, you're not what we're looking for. So I stayed on the hustle. I wound up getting a break by, I'd sent my resume off to the New York Times. And one day they called me and said, hey, our reporter can't make it to Ottawa to cover an Ottawa Senators game. Would you go in their place? I drove to Ottawa, and that led me to my first real break writing for the New York Times. I covered sports games. I covered, I asked athletes how they felt every day. The line of questioning, I'm sure you've seen it in sports locker rooms, is how you feeling? Tell me about the game. Tell me about your next game. And for me, like this was it was putting food on my table, but it wasn't fulfilling me at all. And so I quit that job and joined the Toronto Star with the goal of being a foreign correspondent. And that happened for me in 2009. And I moved my family to India, and we lived there for 4 years, and I covered Afghanistan on the ground. I covered insurgencies and conflict zones in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. And this was such an important time in my life because I got to befriend journalists who were local journalists who were covering these issues and didn't have the fortune that I did to, when my story was done, to get up and leave. And so this was a time when I really learned and saw firsthand the importance in these, that case, in these fragile democracies, of what it really meant to hold truth to power, what it meant to hold governments accountable. And I saw this through their example, and I thought, this is what I want to do with my life. This is what I want to do in journalism. So 2014, I'm back in Canada now, and TSN calls and says, why don't you come and learn television? And I told them I have no interest in covering games at all. And they said, no, like come, you can kind of go wherever you think the stories are. And over 10 years, the network has really held up their end of that bargain. It's been amazing. In 2020, in the middle of COVID, which was bad for everybody, it was especially bad for my family. My 14-year-old son was diagnosed with cancer, and he was admitted to Sick Kids. And for the better part of a year, I spent my time on the 8th floor at Sick Kids, kind of helping him in any way that I could. And during this time, I remember our nightly routine, Carter and I would kind of look at the sports highlights and read news, sports stories from around North America. And one of those stories we saw was about how a player for the Chicago Blackhawks, who was unnamed, had filed a lawsuit alleging that he'd been sexually assaulted by his coach in 2010. And that really struck me. I thought, what's happening with that story, and why am I not hearing about it in any of the other larger media outlets? So over the following 8 or 9 months, I wound up doing no fewer than 40 stories on this. I followed up, and every story that I did would lead to more tips and more stories. And finally, in the summer of 2021, there was enough public pressure on the Chicago Blackhawks organization that the team agreed to hire an independent law firm called Jenner and Block in Chicago to investigate. And months later, in October, the Blackhawks released the results of that investigation, which corroborated all of these allegations that John Doe was making. And I remember one night calling John Doe's lawyer, and this was the night that that report came out, and saying, this is the moment, in my opinion, that your client should come out and tell their story publicly. There is huge public support for him, and I think that if he reveals himself on TV, that this is the moment the Blackhawks will agree to settle, and he will get the justice that he's been looking for. And so that led to this interview on TSN. This is just a snippet of it.
Why come forward now? Putting your name out there, being on television, this is a big decision. And I wonder what your thought process was leading up to this point and why you want to do this.
It's a big step for me in my process of recovery, as I process the events that happened, and as I truly deal with the underlying issues that I have from them. For me, I wanted to come forward and put my name on this. Partially, I'll be honest, it's already out there. The details were pretty accurate in the report, and it's been figured out. But more than that, I've been a survivor. I am a survivor, and I know I'm not alone. I know I'm not the only one, male or female. And I buried this for 10 years, 11 years. And it's destroyed me from the inside out. And I want everybody to know, in the sports world and in the world, that you're not alone. That if these things happen to you, you need to speak up, because there is support systems like Sheldon Kennedy, like the U.S. gymnastics team, like the USA soccer. There is support systems. There is people that are with you. And I hope that this entire process can make a systematic change to make sure this never happens again.
So in my opinion, the day that we aired this was the most important day in the history of TSN. We went on the air in 1984. This interview was 27 minutes, and we ran this off the top of SportsCenter, uninterrupted, with no commercials. We had news organizations from around the world, including our direct competitor Sportsnet, asking they wanted to use clips, and we said you can use whatever you want. As much of it as you want, you can use anything you want. You don't have to credit TSN, just get Kyle's message out there. And this story changed kind of the course of my life professionally. The floodgates opened. I would say that since that interview in October 2021, there has not been a week pass in the last 4 years that I haven't had someone come to me and say they want to share their story, whether it's privately, whether it's because they're looking for accountability from organizations. In some cases, people want their names publicized. I did a story about a man named Tim Tisdale, who was a student at Notre Dame College in Wilcox, Saskatchewan. And for 100 years, Notre Dame has been known, they produced this hockey team called the Hounds. Wendell Clark went there, an NHL star who played for the Toronto Maple Leafs, Curtis Joseph. And that school, which was founded by priests 100 years ago, has only received love and glory from the Canadian media. And then we did a story talking about, abuse that happened to one of their former students, and that is going to lead to more reporting. I'm trying to keep up with all the former students who've actually messaged me. I'd guess it's about 40 so far, and we'll do more reporting on that.
Why come
Another case was Tori Sullivan, a player in the who played professional women's hockey, and she shared her story of being allegedly assaulted by a football player at Boston College when she was a student there, and how when she went to the school, the school chose to support the football player and basically throw her out. So it was a moment for her, and again, to have her voice and to use the TSN's platform to talk about that. This reporting is really hard. Unlike the professionals who are here, I have no training in this about being trauma informed, and we make a lot of this up as we go. There's a real test where editors and I will talk and, well, what's the right thing to do with this story? Does this story fit? Does it meet the bar for us to go down the road? And we don't get it right all the time. Shortly after, we reported on, Yeah, we don't get it right all the time, and I'd love to talk about some of the mistakes that we have made as well. But the truth is, like, after Kyle Beach's story came out, and after we started to do these other stories, and after so many people came forward saying we want to talk about this, TSN made the decision that we were going to own this space in media, that it was going to cost us financially, but we thought that this was the right thing to do, and that it was in the public interest and it was for the public good. So TSN actually created some spots, I'll just show you one of them, to promote this kind of work.
Investigative journalism gives a voice to people who have not had a voice. These are often uncomfortable topics.
It took me too long to ask for help.
Our dedication to the work prompts more athletes to come forward with their stories.
The one thing that I want to make sure that comes from this is change. It was important to me to have that truth come out.
So again, we air this spot, and more people come forward, and that includes athletes from every sport in Canada: figure skating, alpine skiing, gymnastics, wrestling, soccer, every single sport. And it was a bit overwhelming, to be honest. What's interesting, and what I was hoping to tell you about, like, we have in journalism rules, and they're sort of like rules because they've always been there. So, one of the rules is, well, we don't show people what we're going to publish before we publish it, right? We don't do that. And we started down the road with the group of gymnasts, including Amelia Klein, who was a panelist just before lunch. And we invested over 2 years working on this full feature documentary called Broken, which is still on Crave. And it was an interesting learning process. One of the things that the gymnasts in that case shared with us was they were really upset about being told that they would not be able to see this feature before the entire public saw it, and at the same time as the people who they were alleging had hurt them saw it. And so I remember going back to my colleagues at TSN and saying, like, is saying that this is a rule only because it's always been done this way, is that good enough? Or should we try to figure out, like, how do we help these people get what they're looking for without compromising the integrity of the reporting? And so in that case, we sent out a link to the families 12 hours before it was going to be posted on Crave. It went up on a Saturday morning. And so we showed them this feature the Friday night with the understanding that there would be no changes to it, that we were just giving them as a courtesy the chance to see this first. And that sort of is one of the ideas, like, how can we do right? How can we help people? That informs the reporting that we do. Another thing we'll say to somebody if we decide that it works and we're going to go down the road to do a story is, this is your story. And if at any time until the moment this is published or broadcast, if you change your mind, then there's no story. That's a tough promise to keep sometimes. There have been 2 occasions where we've flown a crew across Canada to do an interview, and the person said, no, I'm not ready to do this. So in each of those cases, that is a decision that cost us a lot of money, because we held up our end and we said no. But that's the right thing to do. And also, if those people ever do decide to tell their stories, I have no doubt that they're going to come back to us, because we have established that we are trustworthy. And if they know other people in their community who are looking for an outlet to talk to, I have no doubt that they'll recommend TSN. So I'll show you a little clip from this documentary on gymnastics that's on Crave.
For a while, I just buried it, and then the nightmares started happening.
I was like screaming in pain. I'd be like, stop, you're hurting her. And then she'd be like, shut up.
Those years are just a blur of pain and misery.
I'm just coming to terms with it.
We allowed child abuse to happen and didn't confront it.
The whole gym was run through fear.
I said stop a couple times, but she didn't stop.
That sort of thing was just so normalized. It was just another day in the gym.
There was a lot of potential. I think I could have gone much further.
It is a clear message to everybody in the gym world that if you speak out, you are punished. I was very specifically instructed not to speak about it with Gymnastics Canada or anyone else.
The number of athletes who have sat silent for a long, long time, those stories have gone underground.
It's just this group of little girls that seem to be under attack in this sport.
I'll never move on from it. It's not something that just goes away.
I am a former national gymnast and the lead plaintiff in the class action that was filed.
It's time to step up and acknowledge the hundreds of gymnasts speaking out about the sport's toxic culture. I hear you and I believe you.
People need to know what happened.
So the weeks and the months pass, and we do more reporting on this and more reporting on this. And like I said, we don't always get it right, and it's all learning. I remember when we were doing this feature, Broken, I remember being in Sarnia, in the home of a woman in her 30s. And I went into that story thinking, again, without any education or any grounding in this subject, thinking that there were different kinds of abuse. And the worst was clearly sexual abuse in my mind. And then physical abuse wasn't as bad. And then psychological abuse probably wasn't as bad as that either. And then I remember sitting in the home of this woman in her 30s. And she shared with me how on the day of her wedding, she put on her wedding dress and she looked in the mirror on what should have been the happiest day of her life. And she told me that all she could hear was the voice of this gymnastics coach from when she was 11 years old say to her when she had walked in the gym one morning, so excited to be there, wearing her leotard, ready to go. And this coach says to her, "You look like you have a watermelon in your stomach. What's going on?" And I thought to myself at the time, she has held on to that and it's hurt her for 20 years. And so who am I to say that her suffering, her abuse is not as bad as someone else's? So even though I'm not a subject matter expert in this area like you are, I still think that it's important as a reporter to treat everybody the same and to be careful with everyone who comes and to be honest with them about, what their expectations should be dealing with the media and, walking people through how this works, how long it can take. And, I'm learning about how to ask better questions. Like when someone comes first with a story, asking them, what do you hope to achieve with this? By going public, what do you want to achieve? Do you want us to use your name? And if you do, what consequences could there be for you? And some people do, absolutely. Tori Sullivan, there was no question that she wanted her name made public. Other people, are less inclined to. And so we walk through kind of what that looks like and how that makes the reporting more difficult and how we have to kind of go to more ends to corroborate what they've told us. Anyways, this reporting on reporting leads to a phone call. And at the time, it's May 2022, and I'm in Belgrade, Serbia, doing a playing like a soccer feature on a goalie for Team Canada. And I get a phone call from someone saying, you need to get to London, Ontario, and you need to pull a lawsuit that's just been filed. It's called EM versus Hockey Canada. And this opened the country's eyes, I think, to the underbelly of Canadian hockey culture. It's more than that, it's Canadian sports culture. And so we reported the story May 26, 2022, about this lawsuit. And again, remember the context here. TSN, the company that I work for, is our single most important corporate partner is Hockey Canada. Our single largest source of revenue are the World Juniors Hockey Tournament. And so we did a story that literally blew that up. And we did it putting purpose ahead of profits because it was the right thing to do. That doesn't mean, again, that we get it right all the time. At the same time, in the weeks after we report that story, I get a tip about another story, about a case in 2003 where a young woman allegedly is sexually assaulted by players on Team Canada in Halifax. And in that story, I don't have the slide here for that, but in that story, what I wrote was that this young woman was allegedly unconscious, and while she was unconscious, a group of players had sex with her. And I was cooked online, and I had hundreds of people message me and remark that I had no business in this space reporting on this if I couldn't get my language right. And so I'll be honest, I was very defensive in the first few moments, and I was thinking, look at all the work that we've done. Look at everything we've done to try to affect a positive change. But then, I tried to, look at it from the other perspective. How could I have done better? How did I fall short? And I quickly came to understand that the language, that there is no consensual sexual act, that it shouldn't have been described as sex, that I should have written that this woman was sexually assaulted, allegedly, while she was unconscious. And it took close to a month for me to respond to everyone who had reached out to me on LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter and everywhere else. Some people got my emails too, and cell phone. And it's interesting, that was a lot of phone calls and a lot of conversations, but every single person, when I called them and said, let's talk about this, and I'd start off by saying, I'm sorry, I got it wrong, I should have done better, the public deserved better from me, and I'm going to try to be better in the future, and we've corrected the story to change the language. Every single person, first, I'd say most of them couldn't believe that I was actually taking the time to phone them, but every person was really, really grateful for that conversation. And the lesson that I took away from that was, when you're wrong as a reporter, own it. Say that you're wrong. So again, reporting leads to more reporting, and I get it, and it leads to, in this case, it actually leads to change. So in January 2024, earlier this year, the London police held a press conference where they said that they had screwed this up. They apologized to EM, the alleged victim in this case, and that they were charging 5 players who were members of Canada's 2018 World Juniors team. I was in court yesterday. I saw 3 of those players. I'm going back to court as soon as we're done here to follow through the case. It'll probably take up the better part of the next 6 months to follow that story. But what's interesting is, in that press conference in January, a young woman's watching, and she's messaging me as she's watching this press conference. And that leads to me meeting up with her, and she shares with me the story of how she alleges that in 2014, when she was 22, she had a casual relationship with a young 19-year-old player in the Ontario Hockey League. And she told me that he invited her over in November of that year to the billet home where he was staying during the hockey season. And that when she went there, everything seemed fine. The billet parents were watching TV in the living room. And he guided her down to the basement, and instead of just him and a friend there watching hockey, which is what she'd been led to believe would happen, there was 8 players. And she told me that the guy who invited her took her into the bathroom, and what started as consensual fooling around quickly became a group sexual assault. And she told me that she was assaulted for about an hour by 8 hockey players. So again, that first interview with her is in January. I speak to her, I go back to her home, I go back to her community to meet with her, I checked my notes on this 9 times, 9 interviews. Who did you talk to? So and again, my job in this is not just to hear what she says and put it out, blast it out on the national media. I have to fact check it, right? I have to challenge everything she said. I have to know, who did you tell at the time that you say that this happened? Turns out that she spoke to a friend. She called a friend on the way home from this billet home. So I spoke to that friend and did an independent interview with her and asked her what she remembered about that phone call and what her friend had reported to her. Anyways, that reporting finally led a few weeks ago to this story on CTV, and I'll just show you a quick snippet of it.
I realized that it was not just him and a couple of buddies. There were 8 players in that room.
Anne-Marie says she was led into the bathroom by the player who invited her over, and what started as consensual fooling around became a group sexual assault.
Next thing I know, more players start coming in. They just begin taking their turns, some more than once.
And as you can imagine, that story has led to more tips, which we're chasing down and following up on. One of the most frustrating things about this job is that it does not seem to lead to real change. There are some organizations who, when confronted with a phone call from me or the media, will, reflexively say, yeah, we're looking into this, we're doing this. But it really, truly boggles my mind how our governments, I mentioned the ringette story off the top, how is this not a layup for our governments? If you asked anyone in cabinet at any level of government, is it important to you to keep children safe? Who says no to that? It just seems so obvious. And yet, our story comes out on ringette and we talk about a lack of transparency and secrecy, and the response from the government is silence. Instead of saying, yeah, you're right, we should be making organizations be transparent about this, they instead see me and see the media as an enemy, someone who's made them look bad on a given day. And I wish that would change. I love what I do. I have people all the time who talk about how unusual it is for TSN to be in this space, but I really do feel, and I think you have to feel, that it is going to lead to a positive change and make Canadian sports a safer place. And I'll just share, I got an email from a message on social media, and I'll just share it because there's days when I think like this is hopeless. What's the point of this? After 2 years of reporting on Hockey Canada, after 2 years of parliamentary hearings, after 2 years of national scandal and embarrassment and losing sponsors and seeing their entire board turned over, Hockey Canada today still refuses to be public about any of this. I did a story a year ago about 2 coaches in the Greater Toronto Hockey League. And these coaches walked into their dressing room with 14-year-old boys after a practice one day and said to one of the boys, well, what are you doing on your phone? And the kid said, well, I'm looking at my fantasy football stats. And the coach said, well, if you're too busy looking at fantasy football, how are you going to possibly have time to get laid? And the parents of this boy, and then the coach went on to talk about his own sexual history with 14-year-old boys. And the parents of this boy made a complaint to Hockey Canada, and these 2 coaches were suspended for 6 months. And who did Hockey Canada tell? No one. They kept it secret, and the only reason that the names of those men are public is because they're on TSN's website in connection with the story. And what did they do when they were suspended by Hockey Canada? They walked across the street, literally, to a private hockey academy and started coaching there the next day. Nevertheless, I'm hopeful. And again, one of the reasons for hope is the confidence that we have earned with people who come to us for stories and the messages that we receive. And I'll read you one. I've got permission to read this. Obviously, I've taken out any identifying information. Hi, Rick. I've wanted to message you for some time but it's been so hard to write this. I was sexually abused by my grandfather. It started when I was 5, and it lasted for years. And I kept this a secret for many years until I saw your reporting on TSN. I've been hospitalized several times after trying to take my life, and it's hard to explain why. I've done well in the workforce. I've got children, and I've got a loving spouse. But my abuse feels like a poison that has infected every part of my body, and I can't get it out. I have read and watched all of your reporting on Hockey Canada. I just want you to know that your reporting is making a difference. I think it may have saved my life because it has given me the confidence to tell my family about what's happened to me. I feel like because survivors like Kyle Beach have come forward and are now happy, that maybe I can find some peace. He was referencing Kyle being happy because I posted something on Twitter about how Kyle is now expecting a baby with his partner and is now coaching hockey in British Columbia. So this person finishes writing, "Thanks to you and all of your TSN team for doing what you're doing." And he writes 3 times, "Please do not stop." And then he says, "My thanks to your TSN team for doing what you do. Thank you." And so that's why we do what we do. That's why we put purpose over profits. That's why you won't catch me covering a Team Canada hockey game or an NBA game or an NFL game, because this work is more important. And I love hearing from people about their perspectives on journalism, and I'm happy to answer any questions about anything that we do at TSN, or just general questions about media if you have them. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Hi. Yeah. Hello. Oh.
On. Test. Okay. So I have spoken to different reporters, and I've had good experiences and some where they've said, this isn't quite what we're looking for. And this is not on the topic that we're discussing today. So I'll just mention that to make a distinction. So I guess my question for you is, and I do have another question that's more personal about self-care for you, if you're willing to share. But what's a way to redirect someone that does want to speak up, but maybe it doesn't meet the need of the reporter? Because that can be quite discouraging when someone says, oh, it's too bad that happened, but it's not good enough to share with the public.
Good question. First, I would never phrase it as it's not good enough to share.
Well,
I hear
yeah,
what you're saying.
Yeah.
What I would say, and I've done this work for, it's all I've ever done. So I know media across Canada. And so if someone came to me with, whether it was with a case of abuse in another space, first, if I thought it met the threshold for what we should do, because again, these stories, like the one I just showed you from W5, that took 10 months, right? That took a lot of time. But if it's not sports, so what? Why can't I do that for CTV if it's not sports? So I'm open to it if the story kind of works. And to me, that threshold again is not just not only someone's story of abuse, it's what happened within the organizations that failed, and how can we effect a change to make that better. And if it doesn't work for me, I've had experiences where I'll suggest other reporters, I'll make an introduction, I'll call I've got buddies at the Globe and Mail, I've got buddies at the Toronto Star, CBC, and it's interesting because I think sometimes when a reporter gets a phone call from another reporter saying, hey, I've got a story you might want to chase, the first response is usually negative. It's usually, well, if you're sending me this story, it's because you don't think it's a good enough story. So I'll try to address that up front by saying, I need to talk to you on the phone. And then if I get them on the phone, I'll say, hey, this is a good story. you're the first person I've told about this. And if you don't want to do this, tell me, but you're going to want to do this. And so that's led to, some success stories that way. But the truth is, I haven't been able to help everybody. And, I think I just try to say, This is not to discount your own experience. Unfortunately, I don't have enough resources and time, and I'm one person at an entire network. So, that's not a pleasant phone call.
Well, that's helpful. And even saying, this is a really important topic, let's keep in touch. But I like your suggestion of trying to help pass along the story. My other question, if it's okay, how do you take care of you? You mentioned you don't have that training that you feel you wish you had. It's really hard to hear stories. So what do you do to take care of yourself if you're willing to share?
I've not been really great at that, like in terms of something that's by design. When I was covering foreign affairs for the Toronto Star, I saw death on a regular basis happen in front of me. I was the subject of a kidnapping attempt in Pakistan. I covered a tsunami in Japan where I remember going into one community that had not yet been, where me and another reporter were there before the Red Cross were there. And I remember there was a daycare down by the water, and there were in trees, there were bodies of victims. And so it would be smart for me to have been more proactive. I should have done this. And I'm able to compartmentalize right now. Right now I'm writing a book about the culture of elite minor hockey and junior hockey in Canada. And the stories I'm hearing even now, the hockey world's response to all of this reporting, including what I just showed you, is we acknowledge that things used to be bad in the 90s, but it's better now. Well, again, I've interviewed more than 60 players in the last months, and one quick story. I remember I played hockey this summer, and this is what people in the hockey world don't think about me. They think I'm just trying to burn it all down, and I hate it. I love hockey. It's the best sport. I love playing it. I play it 3 times a week. I played it growing up. My boy plays it. I coached him in the GTHL here in Toronto. I think at its best, it's amazing. And I played hockey this summer, and I meet a guy who's on my team, and he tells me that his son was drafted in the Ontario Hockey League, and he had a 10 out of 10 experience with hockey. And I said, I'd love to hear about that. So we go out for breakfast, the 3 of us, Tom, his son Marcus, and me. And over the course of breakfast, Marcus shares with his dad for the first time that playing junior meant, all of being basically verbally abused by his coach all season. He was drafted in the first round of the OHL, but he didn't make it in the OHL. But his coach in Junior A would call him first round draft pick sarcastically all year. They had rookie duties. He'd have to do the laundry for a veteran player all season. He'd have to buy dinner for a veteran player 6 times a season. And finally, when he finished this laundry list of stuff that happened to him, I said, well, at least you didn't have to go through hazing. This was 2018. And he said, oh, no, we did. We were taking a bus trip back from Buffalo to Toronto, to Aurora. He played for Junior A in Aurora. And on the bus trip, the veterans told all 5 of us rookie players to come to the back of the bus, told us to strip naked, and we all had to jam in together in the bathroom on the charter bus. And if you could have seen the look on his father's face as he's hearing this for the first time, I remember looking at his Tom and saying, how do you feel right now, hearing about this from your son? And he was angry. He felt betrayed. He felt embarrassed that his son had not told him and trusted him with this information before. And I told him, I said, I got to follow up with you after you tell your wife. I want to know what her reaction is. So that's, yeah. I can kind of go off on a tangent here, so sorry. Anybody else?
Hi.
And yeah, I'm working on it. Hi.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your presentation. I just want to take a moment for a collective breath. As you've been speaking, sharing all of these stories, there's lots of sighs in the crowd, and I see arms going up and everything. And sorry, I'm a director of a sexual assault center, so also letting you know and letting folks in the room know that you don't have to do this work by yourself. I hear you say, I'm not trauma informed. I speak to survivors not knowing what to do. There are supports and services available for everybody, not just survivors, but allies and folks who are helping professionals too, or just professionals in the community that want to work with survivors. The Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers is available at sexualassaultsupport.ca, and they have a page specifically for the media, how to use the right words, what words to use, and resources as well. But for everybody present here today, the stories that we've been hearing and continue to hear, and just the topics that we're talking about, sexual assault is hard to hear about. Even if we haven't experienced it ourselves, vicarious trauma is real. And so my colleagues, I'm sitting beside one of them right now, are from the Toronto Rape Crisis Centre, Multicultural Women Against Rape. They have a 24-hour, 7 days a week crisis line available, and that's available for survivors, for allies, for helping professionals, for all of us here listening to these conversations. And it's just like, I just need someone to talk to. I'm just gonna vent. I'm not a survivor, but I heard about this and it's impacting me. So feel free to take the phone number down, 416-597-8808. 416-597-8808. It is available online too. No one took out their phone.
Is Dina Haddish at the Ontario, yeah? So I mean, and
Dina,
I will reach
yes.
out, like I've talked to Dina a bunch. I do this, you're right. I do this regularly. I will call, I think all of them, everyone is run by a woman that I've talked to, but I will call women who run these centers and say, I need help. Like, what do I do? How do I write this? Again, like I made a mistake in my writing. And the commitment, when you, again, we tell this to our kids all the time, right? It's okay to make mistakes, but learn from your mistakes. So one of the things I've learned from that mistake is be very careful on the writing. And so one of the ways I'm careful is reaching out to people like you are just mentioning for advice.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, that was all.
I just want to say thank you. I have big warm feelings for you, and I applaud your efforts, and I thank you for everything you've done. I mean, you are really modeling, like, it's okay to speak out about these injustices, and you kept your job, it seems. So you're kind of like you're making it okay for so many other people to be brave enough to, something over profit?
Purpose before profits.
Before profit. So what's right, not what's easy. And you said your biggest client was the one you were exposing, and you did it, and you were so brave to speak up and do what's right, and you kept your job. So for me, that's like, I just think of St. Mike's College, and I think of, institutions that have gone through such trauma and been exposed for things that are so horrible. And you said change is hard, but change is happening. Like you are really making change. And you said you're not trained in trauma-informed care, but some of the core concepts are to be compassionate, to be caring, to be what was the other word I was thinking of? Careful. You are demonstrating concepts of trauma-informed care because you are caring and compassionate, and you're listening, and you're doing this really important work. And I think change is really going to happen because of it. So I just wanted to thank you and just commend your bravery, because I can imagine having a job and speaking out against the biggest client is really, really frightening and risky.
Thank you. And not to say, it's not always easy. Like TSN, and I give TSN credit for letting me do this work. It does not make me popular, right? Like
here it does.
No, these are my people, obviously, here. But like even not, and I'm not just talking about like in the hockey community and in the hockey world. Like I know even within TSN, it's hard for people, and I'm sure that they're the reporters and the group is over here, and I'm on my own over here, and I'm fine with that, right? That's fine, because I know we're doing the right thing.
Hi. First of all, I just want to echo thank you so much. I grew up in Sarnia, so an OHL town, and I went to school at Brock, so Niagara Ice Dogs is there. So I experienced a lot of what has gone on in the hockey league. And so when this story came out, I think I was like, finally, you know, like it was like, wow, so many people have been living with this for years. And so, yeah, I've been following it all, and so incredible. But I do have a question. So I spoke earlier this morning. And so basically, my case, I was sexually assaulted. I went through the court process, testified, endured cross-examination, but due to staffing shortages, my case was tossed under Jordan timeline. After that, I did a lot of media appearances, and actually my name was used numerous times in Legislative Assembly. And so Kristen Wong-Tam, MPP of Toronto Centre, basically I have my post that I made on Instagram, so I'm just going to read it. But Kristen Wong-Tam asked the Premier, what do you have to say to Emily and all the survivors seeking justice after allowing their rapists to walk free? And Doug Downey spoke, the Minister of Attorney General spoke on Doug Ford's behalf and had a lot of words to say, but essentially said that the official opposition, or the NDP, are chasing headlines and politicizing people's tragedies. And so I just kind of asking you, who's somebody who is a reporter, and who puts yourself in these spaces to hear people's pain and hears people's tragedy and try to find some healing and some justice from this. I wonder what you think of that.
I think I see it for what it is. You know, I know my grandparents ran a dairy farm in just outside Tillsonburg in a little place you'd never see it on a map called Brownsville. And I know he didn't coin this phrase, but my grandpa would always, as we were walking around the farm, he would always say to me, deeds versus words, deeds versus words. And so who better than politicians to come up with great words, right? And again, our job as journalists, and I challenge colleagues about this all the time, and I'll try to do it subtly, not in a way to embarrass anyone, but what are we doing? Are we doing this job because we want to have followers on Instagram or Twitter? Are we doing this job because we like going to hockey rinks and we want to be around pro athletes? Why are we doing this job? What do we hope when we are done that people who look back and reflect on our body of work, what did we do to make things better? And, you know, that conversation is awfully tough to have with reporters. But when you read those comments, where my head goes immediately is into like reporter mode. Like, we need to file some freedom of information requests. I need to know all the conversations happening behind the scenes in government about this. We need to talk to police associations about how they feel. What do the senior crowns say about Jordan? How many Jordan cases are there, right? Like, data can inform some of the best reporting. I haven't seen anybody do a story that actually explains across Canada how many cases like yours, and I'm very sorry for that. Simona told me that you're the one person I should see before. I mean, everybody here, but you especially, before I leave. But
Thanks, Simona.
Yeah, but like, how many cases are there in Canada that are being kicked because of Jordan? Yeah. Does anyone? Sorry. Yours as well. But how many in each province is the number? And if the governments are not tracking this, that's unacceptable. How are they not tracking it? And again, no. So why isn't the media doing that reporting? And why aren't we holding them accountable for that? Like, note to self, well, that might not be the best TSN story, but that story needs to happen.
Well, and honestly, so when I heard about the Hockey Canada case, I had just had my case stayed, and I was like, somebody needs to contact her and tell her about this, because if you advocate for yourself, do you know what I mean? Like, if you advocate for yourself, if you know about this, then you can push as hard as you can. But in the back of my mind, I was like, if this gets tossed, like, do you know what I mean? And it's still kind of, yeah. But.
It's interesting, like being in court yesterday, and like I said, I'll be there later this afternoon. There's 3 hockey players there now, Michael McLeod, Dylan Dubé, and Alex Formenton. And they're and I'm very careful about like how I write about this, and I should be careful about how I speak about it publicly too. In the hallways of the court, they seem very confident. And I think, like, I've wanted, I don't know if it's appropriate to start asking them questions during a preliminary hearing, but I look at them and I've got a million questions for them. And it's where I think their story, and I'm not an expert on this, but their lawyers, who are 5 extremely experienced, well-paid lawyers, I think they believe that those players are going to be acquitted, and they are trying to push. They had a trial date of September 2025, and that trial date was moved up, and the players want it moved up because they believe that if they are acquitted, that there is a path back to the NHL for them by September. Knowing what I know about the case and knowing we're going to be reporting on it one way or another, right? There's a lot of information that's not in the public space yet, and it'll be interesting because, you know, the NHL has its own rules, and being acquitted of a crime does not mean that the NHL wants you in their league. And it'll be a really interesting test if that does happen, if they are acquitted, whether the NHL says that, and the NHL's made so many questionable judgment calls lately about who hockey really is for. We've seen them back away from things like gay pride tape. We've seen their deeds versus words, as my grandfather would say, right? Hockey is for everyone. Their deeds do not back that up.
I just have it's more of a question. It's kind of in relation to what you've been talking about. I was a university athlete for track and field, and I'm from Ottawa originally, and the club that I was with, which is the Ottawa Lions Club, I believe, was kind of investigated for something similar. And I think the coaches were kind of let go, I believe. And some of my friends were kind of victims of this. And at the time going through schooling, it was pretty much entrenched in the culture, so I didn't really think much of it at the time. And then a lot of my friends who were kind of going on to the Olympics, they kind of felt like they need to be silenced in order to kind of further their athletic career. So I guess the question is, like, what's an effective way to kind of address these things before, like, it's an after the fact kind of situation? Because I think this investigation happened several years after I graduated. Could have been like 3 to 4 years, and I found out just because I was doing some volunteer work with Athletics Ontario, and the coaches there knew about what happened with the club team in Ottawa, which also represents the University of Ottawa GG's team. So that is the only club team at the time, I believe, in Ottawa. It's the Ottawa Lions Club, and then they were kind of also in charge of the GG's team. So it's kind of like, and I think a lot of the people that came forward were my friends, and I thought back, and I was asked, it's like, well, did you notice anything? And I was like, well, yeah, like some of these things did happen, but it was such a normalized thing. And it's like, I guess, like I found myself like questioning whether or not if it was inappropriate or like, and why didn't anyone come forward with this sooner? And what's the most effective mode to kind of address it before it becomes like a bigger investigative issue? Let's say, I don't know, because it's like I think everyone kind of knew, and I was only on the team I guess for 5 years, but a lot of these kids were a part of this club since like their youth, right? So that means it's been going on for like could be 10, 15 years for some of them if they started when they were really young, but nothing was addressed until like I guess like 5 years after, like 2011 or so, in that time frame, I would say.
I'm trying to follow you there. I guess I would just answer that by saying, you talked about being a university.
Yeah.
I think that is one of, like, if I look at my list, things to do in 2025, if it's not at the top, it's close to the top. Universities in Canada. They're the most secretive organizations in our country. They protect brand ahead of everything else. I've done some reporting on Canadian universities, but every time you go to a school and ask even like, well, tell me about the number of allegations that your school is receiving, they won't even give you that. Yeah. And to me, that's a real, the non-answer is an answer. Mm-hmm. Oh.
Go ahead. Oh, we have one more question? Sorry.
One more question?
Okay. One more question. Hi, like the others, I'd like to thank you for your work.
I have a question about where this is going in society. I know we had the Me Too movement in 2017, and for many of us that was very encouraging as victims to come forward. But now I'm watching what's happening in the US. Donald Trump was elected president, and he is known to have committed sexual assault. And he's nominated people for his cabinet that are also have been credibly accused of assault. And with all that out there, he got elected. So what are you seeing from your perspective being in the media and looking at it? Are we entering an era where this kind of reporting is going to be less receptive? Or, what's your advice and what are your insights into where we're at right now?
I mean, if I'm being honest, my advice in my own home with my kids is don't watch the news, which is hard to say. This is what I do. I honestly don't know. I think if my mind goes there, it's very hard to process. So instead, I would rather just sort of stay in here and do what I do, right? I can't. Not one of us alone. And this is just how I feel. So other people might feel differently. I don't feel like I can change the system, but when people call me, maybe I can help them. And so I just focus on what I can do with the platform that we have, which and that's no small thing. Like TSN and CTV together, the two networks I work for, I love it. I sent an email this morning to the head of a national sport organization. And the email, I know right now this person is like it's not a great email for them. But holding these organizations accountable, that's my modest role in this. And your question about, I interviewed Donald Trump back in 2000, which is a story, but it's not a story. It's not a story for here. I don't know what to tell you about like a global worldview or even what's happening in the U.S. I mean, we'll see. Good?
Yeah, thank you, Rick.
Thank you. Thanks.
I've got a healthy disdain for journalists. My dad was a journalist.
Great.
But I do hold journalists to a very, very high standard. And you meet it and exceed it all the time. The conversations that we've had, you may not have had any training in this, but you get it. So thank you for shedding light on it. One of my first sexual assault cases was the Maple Leaf Gardens cases back in the late 90s. And then nobody wanted to report on it. And if they did, it was so not helpful to the survivors. And we have come a long way. And thank you. Thank you very much for what you do. Thanks so much.
Yeah, that's great.
We'll talk.
Good?
Yeah.